Hi, I'm Dr. Bojana Weatherly, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Anna Yusim, a Stanford and Yale trained board certified psychiatrist. We talk about spirituality and its role in mental health, healing, and coming to our true, authentic selves. I hope you enjoy this discussion. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bojana Weatherly, and today I have Dr. Anna Yusim joining me. Dr. Anna Yusim and I have known each other for a long time. We have been colleagues and working together in supporting our mutual patients. We were introduced by another physician, and we also have the privilege of serving on the board of Being Health. I'm just going to introduce Dr. Yusim a little bit. You have a very impressive bio, so I'm going to try to do the best I can. Dr. Anna Yusim is an internationally recognized award-winning, board-certified, Stanford and Yale-trained psychiatrist and executive coach. And she has a private practice in New York City, Connecticut, California, and Florida. We cover a lot of the same states with our licensing, with clients including Forbes 500 CEOs, Olympic athletes, A-list actors and actresses, and the chairs of academic departments at top universities. Anna Yusim helps influential people achieve greater impact, purpose, and joy in their life and work. Dr. Yusim is the best-selling author of Fulfilled, how the science and spirituality can help you live a happier, more meaningful life. And as a clinical assistant professor at Yale Medical School, Dr. Yusim is working to create mental health and spirituality program center at Yale with Dr. Christopher Pittenger, which will be a bridge between Yale Medical School and Yale Divinity School, which I'm really excited to hear more about, Anna. Dr. Yusim is also the Chief Medical Officer of Conscious Health, a holistic mental health treatment center based in California that bridges ancient psychospiritual wisdom with state-of-the-art evidence-based mental health interventions like ketamine, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and other treatment modalities. She is the medical lead for Supermind, a mental health startup based in Miami that utilizes personal coaching, binaural beat meditation technology, and an EEG-used biofeedback systems to create targeted precision mental health therapy for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. She's on the board of numerous other enterprises in the mental health space, including Being Health, as we mentioned, Play, and Pause and Purpose. Dr. Yusim has published over 320 academic articles, book chapters, scientific abstracts, book reviews, and articles for the lay public on various topics in psychiatry. She's a frequent contributor to CNN, Fox News, ABC, and NBC, and has been a guest on hundreds of national and international TV shows, radio programs, and podcasts. And I'm so honored to have you here today. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much, Bojana. It is a pleasure to be here with you today.
So I know you and I have many topics that we often discuss and can really do deep dives on. One of the things that we discuss to really kind of focus on today is the role of spirituality and mental health in healing and in really being our true selves. And we also talked about having a conversation around your new book that you're currently writing, which has to do with coincidences and maybe a deeper meaning in that as well. So let me just start by asking you, you integrate spirituality in the way that you support patients through psychiatry and psychotherapy. And this is a very distinct approach that you take, but you believe that this is something that's very integral to the way that you help people and really important for making a true transformation and being our best selves. Let's just start by, how do you define spirituality?
Absolutely, Bojana. And I just want to say again how happy I am to be here with you and that we've shared so many patients over time. And it's not at all a surprise that here we are doing this lovely podcast together. And, indeed, my work has really bridged traditional Western medicine with a more spiritual integrative approach. And so my definition of spirituality is a connection to something greater than oneself, whether that connection is to God or to the universe or a collective consciousness or a set of transcendent values like hope, love, trust, perseverance. Anything that gets us out of our own perspective and onto seeing others, being connected to others, and being of service to others is my connection and my understanding of spirituality.
Great. And I'm curious to hear, when did you start recognizing that by weaving in this concept and this approach, you're doing something different, something better potentially to support your patients long term? And how did you start integrating this into your practice?
Yeah, it's a great question because, had anyone told me like 25 years ago that I was going to be a spiritual person at all, I would have laughed. It was the furthest thing from my mind. I came from a family where my father was very scientific. He was a biomedical engineer and now teaches physics. And my mother, a computer programmer. So very, very math-centered family. If you go way back to their relatives and our relatives way back, everybody's a math professor. So mathematics, science, rationality, that was the spirituality of my family, right? But then my mother also, in addition to being super rational, is very spiritual and always has been, and has been a spiritual seeker. She would read books about different religions throughout my childhood, to learn more, and it was actually a source of conflict in the family because we're Jewish, and my mom would read books about Hare Krishna and about Buddhism, and my father is like, this is sacrilegious. And, so it was very interesting, the pull. And I grew up a lot like my dad, very rational, very scientific. And it was not until unusual and interesting and unexpected things started happening in my life towards the end of my residency training that I really started changing how I see the world. And for instance, an example is I had just come from a lecture and I felt like this urge to go have ice cream at this little ice cream store. So I sat down and I'm eating my ice cream, and a psychic and her young child come up to me and she says, Anna, I have a message for you. Can I give you a message? She looked relatively innocuous. And so I thought, okay, sure, give me your message. So the psychic sits down and proceeds to tell me all of these truths about my life, including the name of the guy who I had this crush on. Nobody knew the things that she was telling me. And I was like, she didn't look me up on Facebook. She doesn't even know my name. Never even met this person before. She didn't read my diary. No one reads my diary, And so how in the world did she know that? And so that just got me starting to think like we were trained in this paradigm where each of our minds are separate and distinct. And yet here, this woman somehow or another was reading either my mind or my soul purpose or my path, or somehow or another, she had this information that she should not rationally have. So what is going on and how does the mind work? So this was actually my foray into spirituality. And it was that experience and several other experiences like this all in short succession that made me start to wonder, maybe the world doesn't work exactly as I was taught in medical school. Maybe there's something more.
And what was the message that she had for you?
Her message was actually, it was interesting. Her message was that everything was going to work out. And I think she specifically meant with that guy. Nothing worked out with that guy, incidentally. But everything in my life did work out, so it was very interesting. So it was a very interesting message, when you, and the message we've all probably gotten, if we've ever gone to psychics, everything's going to work out. But what does that really mean? And how does that really look? Does it look the way that we anticipate it to look? Do we get what we want? Or do things work out in a way that's even better than expected, or not in a way that we expected at all?
I'm curious, how much do you think your own openness, maybe through exposure to your mother and her readings and curiosities, how much of that influenced the fact that you were open to these several events that happened in your life at that time, versus do you think that if it had happened to a different version of you or somebody else, perhaps they could have easily said, oh, this is a pure coincidence and there's no meaning, there's no deeper meaning?
Yeah, absolutely. I think about this often, actually, and I do believe that I have in part become a spiritual person because there's something genetic about that in the genes. And I got this from my mother. I really do believe that. And I feel that to some degree, people's spiritual outlooks, their perspectives, how they interact with God, spirituality, etc., has a genetic basis. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's also a hardcore scientist, very hardcore scientist, and yet has incredible faith, especially at times in his life when things have been the most challenging and where his faith was tested the most, he's always able to fall back on faith. And my first question to him was, what kind of family did you grow up in? And is that indicative of what your family was like? And it was indeed, because, for some people, faith is very difficult to have. For other people, it's just in their genes. It's just the way they are. It's not to say that we shouldn't work to, strengthen our faith when it is difficult. And that's been for me. But for me, faith has not been an easy thing. It's actually been quite difficult during time of challenges to maintain faith. And so it was very interesting to meet a diehard scientist. I had dinner with him just a few weeks ago, who was telling me about his family, who was very, very scientific and faith-based, and how that was sort of his path as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think especially, one of the things that you and I have had conversations about is coming from families who are scientific. So similarly to you, my father was an engineer, my mother a computer scientist and mathematician. And obviously, you and I both chose to go into medicine. So there's an element there of we like scientific rigor. That's something that appeals to us. We like concrete data, and we are in the pursuit of knowledge, and we want to support people and make an impact in the world. And so, but we're going about it in this, again, very scientific way. And it's interesting, I think, that when you come from a family where you're seeing the perspective of one side of the family who may not necessarily have any religious or spiritual beliefs, and then the other side of the family that might be superstitious or might believe that there's something beyond that we don't know, or there's kind of a mystery. It's interesting growing up with different points of view, and then how do you choose what to adopt for yourself, or does that choose you, again, as you said, based on your genetic profile, based on the experiences in your life? It's very interesting. And then how do you reconcile the fact that, again, throughout our studies, all we are exposed to, and I think we're in a way in medicine, again, a self-selecting group of people, is, again, that scientific rigor, show me the data. Let's be critical about this study that was published, and here are the flaws, here are the advantages of experimental design, here are the flaws, here's how I interpreted the data, and so forth. And so we come at it from this very analytical standpoint, whereas something like spirituality and this belief, what is belief? And what is meaning, and what is that connection? It's so intangible and so hard to grasp, right? Sometimes I even wonder, do we have the capacity we probably don't, to really fully understand, right? How did you, did you find that you had resistance to this, or these kind of like opposing parts of Anna that were kind of like, no, Anna, what are you talking about? And then the other side, like, hey, come over on the other side. This could be something really interesting and meaningful.
Yes, it's such a great perspective, point, and question, Bojana, because absolutely, it's like we're always reconciling those parts of ourselves. And I feel like within myself, as I mentioned, I have these two parts. My father, who's super scientific and rational and not particularly spiritual. He's become more so because I've become spiritual. So like we're so close, and he's like, okay, maybe, And then there's my mom, who's always been like, for her relationship with the divine is first and foremost, that trumps everything, And so it's so interesting. Yes, that exists within me, both my father's doubt and my mother's belief. And so I think of myself as a person of faith, but what that means for me is that I believe that there is a possibility of something despite all my doubts, and that no matter what I believe, I'm always going to have doubt, because the scientist lives within me too. And so, I studied for a few years at the Kabbalah Center, and Kabbalah is like a form of mystical Judaism, or the science of how energy works in this world. And they talk about this principle of absolute certainty, no doubt, right? That you just have to have certainty. And I don't know if I'm capable of that. And I've tried for certain things to have certainty. And then I'm like, okay, this is going to happen, and many times I'm certain and it happens. But the truth is that that's not how I'm wired. And I don't think I'll ever be wired that way. And you sort of have to, and I don't know if I want to trump the doubt within me, because that's such a crucial part to this other part of my being, which is the scientist that seeks to understand everything. And so ultimately what my work has been integrating these two seemingly disparate paths, right? The science, which is rational, subjective, empirical, subject to experimentation, and the spiritual, which is the opposite, which is quite subjective and transcendent, very difficult to study scientifically. And the most interesting thing, what we're trying to do at Yale, is figure out a way to study these questions scientifically and to take that to the next level.
I love that. That's so interesting. In your day-to-day practice, right? You've worked with thousands of patients, you've worked with coaching clients. I'm curious, how do you introduce spirituality? And is this something that, if you had a percentage, what percentage of people might be receptive to this? And how does that work in the context of psychotherapy?
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, but I will sometimes introduce spirituality, but rarely, because I usually will meet the patient where they're at. And now that this is what I'm doing, the majority of patients that come to me are spiritual and they're specifically seeking that out. But a lot of people aren't still, and that's okay. So you meet them where they're at and you understand the world through their lens and their perspective, and that you understand what healing will mean within their framework. And then sometimes if their framework is too constrained, then you introduce another more expansive framework, such as if someone has terminal cancer and is given X months to live, you're like, you know what? There actually are communities where people experience miraculous healings from this. And that's a thing. And here's some case studies of that. And then you expand their perspectives and you're like, talk to me about your perspective on miracles and spontaneous remissions and healings. What do you think of that? So those are situations where I would bring a more expansive spiritual perspective. But oftentimes people will come wanting a more spiritual perspective, or they come as they are and we accept them as they are.
And I agree with you in terms of meeting the person where they're at, right? In medicine and in working with people, it's so important to acknowledge and understand that. And it's often takes time to really understand where is somebody at, and that might change over time. So I think it's so important as physicians, as healthcare providers, to ask that question and to really actively listen and assess. So for the individuals that, let's say, they are open to incorporating spirituality in their work, how does that usually come up? Are there certain things that maybe you specifically work on in the sessions? Are there certain elements that maybe you give them for homework to practice? What might that look like?
It's a great question. It's like, right. And that's the whole thing. Spirituality is a connection to something greater than oneself, but the way that it could manifest within your work as a doctor with a patient is a millionfold, right? It could be an exploration of the idea of synchronicities and miracles and getting guidance from the universe in that way, or starting to expand your perspective to, I'm going to die of cancer, to maybe I won't, maybe there is a chance, and kind of opening that possibility of, wow, there's something greater. And there's people who've survived terminal illness, and a lot of people actually, and they tell their stories, and there's lots of publications on it. And, and I could read about this and what have they done? And there's books on it, so that's one way that it could show up. Another way is people feel very alone in their symptomology. And part of what spirituality is, if you connect to something greater, you are no longer alone, right? You have support, you have guidance, you have love. And how does that show up? And how do we tap into that? And how do we understand that? How do we use that for the benefit of ourselves, for our patients, for humanity? So exploring that space. And then the other way is really starting to explore the concept of a soul. So in my training, both at Stanford and Yale, nobody really mentioned soul. It really wasn't part of our lexicon, right? And as a psychiatrist, the prefix psyche actually could be translated as soul, doctor of the soul. And yet this word soul is never mentioned. And so why is that? And this was something that was of deep interest to me in my residency. And I started to travel around the world to try to understand this concept of soul and try to understand, how is the soul involved in healing? And this took me to ashrams in India, learning Buddhist meditation in Thailand, studying Kabbalah in Israel, working with shaman in South Africa, South America, ultimately coming back to the States to have a much larger, broader understanding. And my favorite definition of the soul from all of this came from a Mexican shaman named Fernando Broca. And he talked about the soul as being divided in two parts, or all of our souls are comprised of two parts. The part that connects us to everybody and everything, often they say that we're one unified soul, and also the part that encapsulates our own uniqueness. So your unique set of talents, skills, abilities, interests, etc., the way that you can make a contribution in a way nobody else can. And so those are the two parts of the soul, our interconnectedness and our uniqueness. So the third way that I help people is by helping them connect to their soul, to their authenticity, to their purpose, to their soul correction, to their soul contribution, things of that nature.
I've heard you use that term soul correction before. What does that mean?
Yeah. So that is a Kabbalistic term. And in Kabbalah, the word for it is tikkun, which means correction. And so we all come with a certain correction that our soul has come into this world to make. And you can recognize what your correction is by asking, what is the greatest challenge in my life? What keeps coming up again and again and again, often to my chagrin and dismay, and despite my best efforts to change it? And it's what Sigmund Freud would equate to being your repetition compulsion, those things that come up over and over and over. You're trying to work on it, but it's just the most difficult thing for you. So that is one soul correction. And for everybody, it's different. For one person, it could be to be more interdependent with others in a loving relationship. For another person who's too dependent already, it's to become more independent in relationship with others. For some people, it's to overcome addictions. For some people, it's to be a mother. For some people, it's to harness their personal power. For some, it's to overcome fear. Those are just a few examples of soul corrections.
Mm-hmm. So this idea that we come into this world and there's a specific, unique, individual purpose that we have in terms of overcoming something, and that can show up in different ways. So whether it's fears or phobias, whether in relationships, maybe we kind of keep choosing the same partner over and over again, and the same things happen in different relationships. And so really gaining that insight from what is it that's a real challenge in my life that I keep coming up against in different ways, and then turning to yourself really to examine that and essentially correct it or repair it.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And have you found, and this may be more difficult to quantify, maybe this is one of the things you're going to be doing at Yale in combining spirituality and psychiatry, but have you found that when we do this, right, when we engage with our soul, when we engage in our own unique way with something that's beyond ourselves, that we're a part of, that we're connected to, some greater purpose, do you generally find that people have better outcomes when it comes to mental health, physical health, overall well-being? I know these things can be quantified in different ways, and at outcomes or mental health, we look at specific questionnaires that can rate depression or anxiety, or there are different quality of life questionnaires or physical symptoms and that kind of thing. I'm curious if this has been done and to what capacity, or if this is maybe something you're going to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been done. And I'll tell you about the work that's been done. And I certainly, in my practice, have seen it over and over and over again, that the more expansive one's perspective, the more that they engage the mind, body, and spirit in the healing, the more comprehensive and fast the healing proceeds. So this is what I've seen time and again. But that's also my belief, and my belief has been confirmed about that. And that certainly has been the case for a number of scientific studies. I'll tell you some of the most interesting studies with respect to mental health. There is some studies on suicide by Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard. He's head of the Flourishing Center at Harvard. And he shows that for hundreds and thousands of people, both men and women, attending church weekly reduces suicide by a humongous percentage, by 5 times, right? And suicide in my profession as a psychiatrist is the failure of my profession. It's, no turning back. We have been unable to help this person. They have succumbed to whether it be a death of despair, which is addiction, depression, etc., or, to their own hand for whatever reason, whether they reached out for help or not. So I see suicide as really, in many ways, the failure of our profession. We try to reduce suicide at all costs. So the fact that something like church attendance can reduce it by 5 times in both men and women. Humongous effect size, humongous statistic. And then they went to look at what is it exactly about church attendance that does this? Is it the fact that there's community? Is it about life-affirming beliefs that people get when they go to church? It was none of that. It was actually a moral prohibition against suicide that church going creates, which is really interesting, right? If the end result is that less people kill themselves, God bless, great. Have this moral prohibition, right? We don't necessarily want to be endowing everybody with moral prohibitions left and right. And yet this is a good moral prohibition to have. So it's very interesting.
I'm curious if there have been any studies on physical health. I know I remember remotely looking at some literature in patients that are in palliative care and the association with prayer and so forth on quality of life at that stage, if I'm remembering correctly. But I'm curious if more has been done to that end.
Absolutely. So in cancer patients, spirituality has been associated with less distress and better quality of life, regardless of how threatening the cancer. Individuals attending church weekly were less likely to be hospitalized for any reason and spent less time as inpatients than those who went to church less frequently. Religious and spiritual commitment has been associated with reduced depression in the elderly, quicker recovery, reduced worry and fear, and less alcohol dependence. And in a study of about 700 adults with alcoholism, one of the strongest predictors of sustained remission was actually having a spiritual awakening. So it's no secret that a healthy spirit leads to a healthier mind and body. And studies have also shown that this concept of spiritual health is correlated with greater peace living with HIV and healthier lives in people with asymptomatic heart failure. This is kind of broad strokes, but this gives you a sense of the various conditions that are affected. And by no means is this exclusive of all conditions.
That's very interesting. And I suppose in some cases, there may be an association that might be causal or that may not be causal, but maybe both are factors that contribute to or are reflective of spirituality and then improved outcomes. Do you find that sometimes it takes a tragedy or a very difficult health or mental situation for people to turn to spirituality? Do you think that's something that might make people be more prone to believing or turning to it?
It's such a great question. I think so. I think absolutely. And I think when people encounter hardship, they will go in one of two directions. Some people will go in the direction of having more faith because they don't know where else to turn. And other people will go exactly in the opposite direction and lose faith. And it's sort of like they're unable to answer the question of why do bad things happen to good people? So tragedy and hardship create humongous shifts in people's lives. Some people can contract and other people can greatly expand. It's very interesting.
It is so interesting. Last week I did an interview with an integrative colorectal surgeon, and we were talking about one of the questions that she asks is, she treats a lot of people with cancer as well as inflammatory bowel disease, and they see her when there's a surgical consultation. So she often asks patients, why do you think this happened? And has shared some stories around this kind of greater meaning or connection to even prior trauma as they're working out their current condition, or maybe having surgery for the current condition. There can be this relationship between something that had happened in the past that was unresolved that now starts to get resolved. And I thought that was really interesting. And we know that making, I suppose we know that making meaning out of situations can help us in the growth process after trauma, right? So can you speak a little bit more to that of how do people generally start making sense of why did this happen to me, if they do pursue that spiritual and that expanded awareness kind of, how do I make sense of this horrible thing that happened?
Yeah. It's such a great question because who hasn't had something horrible in their life happen for which they need explanations and which stumps them and which could lead them to lose faith, etc. And I feel like this is our meaning making process as human beings. And the meaning making process is very complex. And there's many steps that are entailed in it. The first one being to have your natural response and eventually get to a place of acceptance. And oftentimes, the DABDA process that has to do after with when somebody dies, it's often a similar process when you are dealing with something really, really traumatic because it is the death of something. It's the death of a relationship or the death of a hope or the death of an ambition. This is, what many of these traumas are, or the death of an actual person. And so first you're in denial. You're like, did this really happen? This can't really be. And then you're in anger. You're angry at God, at yourself, at the world, at others. You could feel like a victim. You can give away your power. You can become the perpetrator as a form of projection, and then bargaining. Bargaining is like, I'm going to make things different. I'm going to grow from this. When people are overcoming trauma or difficult experiences, that bargaining thing is their will forward. It's like, I'm going to create something positive out of this negative. I'm going to bargain with myself, with the universe, do whatever I need to do to expand and find a solution. And then there's the depression and then acceptance. Those don't always happen in the same order. They don't always happen even in that order when it comes to somebody's death of a loved one. But I think it's very similar when people encounter great hardship. It's a very similar acceptance process.
Is this something that you plan to study more at the Yale Center? And tell us a little more about that.
Definitely, definitely. So this is something I've been working on for 2 years together with Dr. Chris Pittenger, and we are bridging the Divinity School and the Medical School. And we've just submitted a Templeton grant for some research around this. But we have 3 research projects. We're awaiting our funding now and gathering funding. The first 3 research projects are going to be first on the spiritual side of psychedelic use, because at Yale, we are studying the neurobiology of psychedelic use for various conditions and using various psychedelics, but no one's currently looking at the spiritual side of psychedelic use. So that's going to be one of our projects. And then we're going to be looking at the nature of intuition and how people receive intuitive information among people who hear voices. And so, but also among people who receive intuitive information in other ways. So my thought is that your intuition is often the voice of your soul. There's many other understandings of intuition as well. But we have a researcher at Yale, Al Powers. His whole research is on voice hearers. And its voice hearers could be schizophrenics, but they could also be psychics. Schizophrenics have no control over the voices and can go down a big spiral in terms of the quality of their life and what they're able to accomplish in this world. Psychics, in contrast, often do have control over these voices, and they can use that for the benefit of themselves, for others, and humanity. And so one of the questions was, how can we teach the psychics or to teach the schizophrenics? How can we learn from the psychics and teach the schizophrenics? And so all of his research in the past has used the psychics as the control group. But now we're going to be using the psychics as our experimental group to understand how they receive information. So hearing voices is a form of clairaudience. It's receiving intuitive information through that. But you can also receive intuitive information through clairsentience, which is through your feelings and emotions, through clairvoyance, which is through seeing in your mind's eye, through claircognizance, which is just knowing and not knowing how you know, and then the clairaudience, which we mentioned, which is through hearing information. So we're going to be studying that in Al Powers' lab. And then the third research study is going to be about neural correlates of spiritual experiences. And this is with Dr. Mark Potenza working together with Dr. Lisa Miller at Columbia. We're going to be studying the ways in which our thinking about spiritual experiences affects our brain and where in the brain that shows up.
That's fascinating. So these are going to be done through some sort of imaging, functional MRI, or?
Exactly.
I see. I have a question to go back to the people hearing voices. That's really interesting, that the parallel that you're drawing in the study that you outlined. I remember having gone through rotations in psychiatry and having my own limited experience with people with schizophrenia and auditory hallucinations, I noticed that oftentimes there are these common threads in the hallucinations of people that are very different. And I always wondered, what is it about the wiring or wherever they may be receiving information from that makes their auditory hallucinations so similar across cultures, across geographic areas, socioeconomic status? Like there's this commonality that cannot otherwise be explained by localization or culture or anything else. I'm curious if that's been studied and what does that mean?
That's so interesting. So, can you talk a little bit about the similarities that you have observed or heard about?
Yeah. So, for instance, one of the common observations that you might see in a patient with schizophrenia with auditory hallucinations might be, the TV is talking to me, or I'm having paranoid delusions that they are after me. Oftentimes, it can be a connection with God. It can be a connection with, the world is ending and they're after me, or they're after me for such and such. And so some of these delusions of paranoia, or who is talking to them, or the fact that it could, it's coming from the TV, or it's coming from these specific sources. Like there's some elements around paranoia is the first thing that comes to mind, just because that's probably what where I've observed a lot of those common threads. And then the other one would be the feelings of grandiosity, right? This is more in a patient that may have bipolar, with some psychotic features, meaning again, there's that kind of similar thread of there's kind of loss of touch with reality as we know it, but they're communicating with some source that may be telling them, you're capable of these things, and you're gonna, and a lot of those things seem to have common threads.
Yes, that is such a great question, Bojana, because that's exactly right. Like, even in residency training, we're taught about the nature of hallucinations are, for instance, command auditory hallucinations, where there is a voice telling you what to do, jump out a window, hurt this person. Then there's, ideas of reference, which is when you might hear something and like the TV is talking to you, or that sign, that billboard is speaking directly to you. It's very, very interesting. And then there's certain kinds of delusions that are culturally specific, right? That exist in certain cultures and not others. And there was somebody, when I was doing my residency at NYU in Bellevue, there was somebody who wrote up, because they they were at the Bellevue emergency room. So this is like all of the most serious cases in all of New York City would go through Bellevue. It was super, super interesting. And there was the Truman Show that came on. And you remember the Truman Show, where there's a specific delusion that you're the only one that's real and the whole world is like not real. And it was after that show that there were people coming into the emergency room with this Truman delusion, that he had like 3 people over the course of the year. And so prior to that, people don't remember any of that,
I
and then
see.
after that, yeah.
So it's
And
a
so,
suggestion maybe from something going on in the
yeah,
society, in pop culture,
yeah,
something they've been
yes.
exposed to.
To some degree. So I think from a cultural anthropologic perspective, that's definitely the case. There's something societal and cultural. However, a lot of people with schizophrenia would never have those suggestions because no one chooses to have schizophrenia. And I think that you're exactly right, that it's a certain part of the wiring, or the part of the wiring might be for paranoia. And then if you are wired for paranoia and just feeling very paranoid about everything, then you're going to start to put everything into that paranoid framework, which would be like, this person's against me. This is against me. This radio is talking to me. There's people in my house. I can't trust anybody. So it's almost like that is how we as humans make meaning. It's another meaning-making process, but a meaning-making process gone awry.
And tell me a little bit more about the psychics.
Yeah, super interesting. I feel like there is some amazing psychics out there with true power. But I've also had a lot of patients who have had addictions to psychics. And what does that look like? That looks like whenever you have to make a decision, you call a psychic. It's like it's fascinating. And there are psychics, with real powers, and when people don't want to take responsibility for their life, or think that for some reason somebody has greater insight into their own life than they do, and so they're willing to pay some money to be temporarily not accountable for their life and give that accountability over. And I think there's also a control thing there because some psychics claim to see the future. And so there's people who, I want to know how this is going to, I want to not make any effort or not like make any big decision before I know how it's going to work out. So there's actually a lot of psychics who are consultants for big business people and famous celebrities, et cetera, when they make big decisions. But I have known many psychics, and I've never met a psychic who is consistently on par and right. Psychics always make mistakes. And you also don't know if the psychic is reading you and your desires, or if the psychic is actually reading the reality and how, the consciousness level of that psychic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how do you really assess their level of intuition? And I guess the other question is, what allows them to have maybe a greater level of intuition and that connectedness?
Yeah, exactly. And some people have very real abilities. They have it seems like true magic. But if you don't work on yourself, bad things are going to happen too. Like I know some psychics who have just, by virtue of being psychics, make bad predictions for powerful people that end up really undermining them, their credibility, and end up screwing up the lives of the powerful people because the powerful people are silly enough to listen to them. So it's I've certainly seen this happen as well. So it's a very, you have to be very careful who you trust with important decisions, and to not base your, probably to the viewers here, to not base important life decisions on what a psychic tells you. I've had patients with whom I work very closely on this.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to really working on yourself, accountability, and really digging deep into finding your true authentic self, because that's where those decisions are going to come from. That's where that intuition is going to come from. And there's no shortcut for that. There's no shortcut for, when we're faced with challenging or big decisions.
Exactly.
So that's interesting to me that, your observation that some people might actually put so much kind of value or into what this person tells them. Tell me a little bit more. I know we only have a few more minutes left. I know that in your book, Fulfilled, one of the things that you talk about and is this idea of perceiving guidance from something greater, from the universe, and that sort of touches on intuition, but that also touches on perhaps these coincidences that we mentioned as well, and something that you're currently writing about. Tell me a little bit more about that. And I know one of the things that you've shared with me before is sort of the idea that we can create or maybe be more in tune with when certain things happen, and maybe be more in tune with the meaning of those things that might help us in life. So tell me a little bit more about that before we go.
Absolutely, yes. So synchronicity is a term coined by Swiss psychologist Carl Jung to describe the co-occurrence of two things that is acausal. So I think about you and then you call me. Did my thinking about you lead you to call me? No, but yet nevertheless, the fact that that happened in short succession with temporal proximity makes it meaningful to me. And that's thus a synchronicity. So the synchronicity is more in the meaning that we ascribe to an event, or to the co-occurrence of two events, than it is about the event itself. But plenty of people can say that's a total random coincidence, and it very well may be. But I believe that if we are open to that and looking for that, these sorts of coincidences or synchronicities happen more and more. And some people believe that it's these synchronicities that are also your guidance from higher power or from the universe. And that, a number of positive synchronicities about a certain subject or in a certain day is like, you're going in the right direction, go. A number of negative synchronicities where you're trying and for no reason whatsoever, crazy things happen, things just don't work out. We've certainly all had that, is also the universe saying, maybe this isn't the right direction for you, and then what my next book is the science of miracles, with a miracle being defined as something highly beneficial, yet statistically improbable. And some people can think of miracles as being on a continuum with synchronicities. So like a miracle, you have a spontaneous remission from cancer after doing some sort of special work, etc. And so you can think of that as being a little bit further on that continuum. So little coincidence, big coincidence, miracle.
I see. And are you going to be using case studies and people's real life
Definitely,
experiences here?
definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
That sounds really interesting. I think that our brain goes to, or certainly my scientific brain goes to, again, like we need to see the data. I want to see the data, and I want to, but again, there's like a curiosity, there's a belief that, and certainly a knowing that we just actually don't know or understand most of what's actually happening, right? And so I think that's really fascinating, kind of trying to make sense of these things that are highly improbable, and kind of what does that mean? Well, this was such a pleasure, Anna. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add as we go, but this truly was a pleasure, and I look forward to having more discussions with you.
Wonderful, Bojana. This was so wonderful, and I so enjoy this, and I too look forward to many more.
Likewise. And I hope this was helpful for our viewers and listeners. And
Mhm.
if you have any questions, feel free to reach out on social media. And I agree with you, Anne. I think we'll have also some links to the studies that you mentioned. I think that could be really helpful for people as well.
Absolutely.